This is the third seminar this semester for our new Centre for the Study of Popular Music and Popular Culture. And I'm delighted today to be able to present to you on some work that I've been working on in relation to David Bowie and Ireland, but more particularly David Bowie's interest in and his use of ideas and concepts developed by Samuel Beckett in particular, and also his interest in the artist Jack B. Yeats. It's for me, I suppose it's a peculiar kind of a paper in that while in passing I will talk about methodology and I will talk about the reading of texts, and I will refer to work that I've done with Eoin and Martin, where we've done more traditional sociological textual analysis of Bowie's videography, for example. This seminar and the content I'm talking about is quite deliberately far-ranging and provocative in terms of what I'm trying to bring together. So the late David Bowie was a cultural bricoleur who drew upon a vast array of influences to create his art. While Bowie successfully managed to reinvent himself many times and to maintain a mystique around his influences, it is, I argue, possible to decipher the Bowie Code through a close critical reading of his work and the things that he sometimes revealed or chose to reveal in interviews. It's in this context that I examine Bowie's relationship with Irish writers and artists and his use of saying in his work. My seminar today evidences how Bowie was deeply familiar with Irish writers and artists. In doing so, I'm going to focus in particular on Bowie's interest in Samuel Beckett and the painter Jack B. Yeats in particular. Apart from Bowie's affinity and knowledge of both men's creative outputs and other shared commonalities, such as an interest in music, German Expressionism, Modernism and Surrealism, I show how their use of clowns, influenced largely by the Italian tradition of Commedia dell'arte, indelibly link all three. Perhaps most provocatively, at the end of my paper, I argue that Bowie's interest in Samuel Beckett is most apparent in the final stages of the singer's career, most notably in the music videos for the songs Where Are We Now and Lazarus. David Bowie's first ever Irish performance was in December 1969. Aged just 22, he was a guest on RTE's Like Now series. Like Now was a preliminary effort by RTE to have a youth audience to reach out to the young people of Ireland. And Bowie comes over to Dublin with shoulder-length curly tresses and sporting, as you can see here, a very fashionable Afghan coat. He sang his latest single, Space Oddity, regaling the audience with the dramatic tale of a breakdown in communication between Grand Control and Major Tom. Bowie's Irish debut is forever captured in a series of black and white still shots in the RTE archives. This performance in 1969 was the start of a very long, creative and personal relationship with Ireland. The singer would perform and rehearse in Dublin many times over the next 4 decades, even surprising his fans by playing at least 4 secret gigs, including a support slot as tin machine at the Beckett Inn. Bowie's Irish roots run very deep. Born David Jones in 1947, David Bowie's mother's maiden name was Margaret or Peggy Burns. Like so many others in post-famine Ireland, Peggy Burns' paternal grandparents were Irish immigrants who settled in Manchester in the mid-19th century. Bowie's great-grandmother, Mary Eileen Heaton, was born in 1852 in County Tipperary. Given Bowie's Irish heritage and the fact that he lived, worked, and performed in Dublin, we shouldn't be overly surprised about Bowie's interest in Ireland and Irish culture. So today I want to evidence Bowie's interest in Irish writers and artists and show how he referenced saying in his creative outputs. I'll demonstrate how Bowie's focus on Samuel Beckett and Jack B. Yeats point to, as I've said, a shared interest in the figure of the clown. All 3 men may be seen to have contributed to a much older clowning tradition associated with the Commedia dell'arte. Bowie's interest in and use of clowns was apparent from the very start of his long career. In 1971, he told one interviewer, "What the music says may be serious, but as a medium, it should not be questioned, analysed, or taken too seriously. I think it should be tarted up, made into a prostitute, a parody of itself. It should be the clown, hero medium. The music is the mask, the message wears, music is the hero, the I, the performer, and the message." It's clear from this early statement by Bowie that he may have been dismissive of the very idea of taking music and its related cultural artifacts apart in order to ascertain their influence or their meanings. I'm not quite sure. So in spite of Bowie's statement in 1971, as a cultural sociologist, I would take the view that popular cultural forms are a legitimate object of analysis. Bowie's broad palette of influences, as much as his capacity to appropriate, to cut up, to mash up, and to act as a trickster and obfuscate, confront researchers and others with many interpretive challenges, and can, I hold, best be engaged with through adopting a hermeneutic approach. So in the research I'm doing on Bowie's cultural creative outputs, my exegesis is based on a thorough familiarity with his creative outputs, as well as an appreciation of the many influences, including specific Irish influences, which shaped his thinking and his creativity. And in doing this work, I'm going to publish a book chapter in Mexico on this theme, and some journal articles as well, not only on clowning, but on his relationship with Samuel Beckett. The obvious intention is to try and contribute to what is now a growing body of academic scholarship on David Bowie's work. I don't think David Bowie, quoting this a number of years ago, had COVID-19 in mind, but the phrase, "give a man a mask and he will tell you the truth," is, I suppose, today. I think what we need to realise as well that when we think about David Bowie, and we think about him as a figure, as an important cultural figure, writing about him and writing about the influences and his use of, and the sort of mining that he did of a wide range of influences, presents us with a very challenging task. I see David Bowie as a sort of postmodern Oscar Wilde, who acted as a cultural magpie or bricoleur. So Bowie was all at once a widely read polyglot, engaged with the avant-garde. He was a genius, a trickster, who adopted and performed through various personae, and, crucially, by masquerade. Putting it more accurately, David Jones, the person, performed as David Bowie, who in turn performed as a range of persona that David Bowie, or David Jones, created. So he expressed himself creatively, as you know, through a series of changing identities, as Ziggy, as Major Tom, as the Thin White Jew, as Pure, the clown, and as, in recent years, before his untimely death, as straight David Bowie. As a songwriter, writer, essayist, performer, recording artist, music producer, actor, film producer, and painter, David Bowie drew from a very wide range of influences, including Buddhism, German Expressionism, Surrealism, Dadaism, Kabuki, philosophy, occultism, communications theory, mime, Oriental culture, and Jungian psychology. Bowie's many strengths included his ability to divine and synthesize complex ideas from these and other sources, but also, crucially, not to reveal too much about the actual origins of the ideas that he was channeling and when they surfaced in his art. I think this is really interesting about Bowie, his capacity to obfuscate, to queer, to hide in plain sight, to mess with the paintwork was highly effective, but it is possible, I hold, through a close critical reading of his work, as I've said, to trace at least some of the influences, creative practices, and recurring key thematic concerns. Now, what is interesting about Bowie is, and I've often said this when I'm teaching about Bowie, when I talk about fan studies and so on in undergraduate or postgraduate classes, and I often kind of use the sort of glib phrase that Bowie clearly had issues with serious addiction in the late 1960s, early 1970s, indeed right through when he cleaned up in 1980. And I've often said about Bowie that he replaced cocaine, and alcohol, and other forms of addiction, sex, with reading and engaging with culture. And we know when Bowie is on tour in the 1980s and 1990s, a fixed part of his touring entourage was a massive library. So his library went everywhere with him. I know anecdotally, this man read a book a day. So when he moved to New York and settled down and he put straight in his out and all the rest of it, stopped taking drugs, he read a book a day. And if you look at the lists of books that he has provided us with in terms of things that were influential on him, there's a really interesting book just published last year by John O'Connell called Bowie's Books, which documents the 100 most significant books in Bowie's reading. So it's really interesting then how he channels ideas from the occult, from surrealism, from Jungian psychology, from philosophy. He was really well read in terms of mass communications theory. So clearly this guy was reading everything. He had a voracious appetite in terms of reading. So by all accounts, Bowie, as I've said, was a voracious reader across genres and cultures, as is evidenced from even a cursory glance at his creative work. His hunger for books and ideas was echoed in Samuel Beckett's claim in a 1936 letter to his friend Thomas McGreevy to have been reading all over the place. When the David Bowie Expo, David Bowie is ... took place in the Victoria and Albert Museum, Bowie was asked to give a list of his top books, the books that he's most favoured and most influential on his thinking. So they include, Inferno, they include Eugene Ginsberg, they also include Cocoon by Spike Milligan. It's a really interesting mix of books that he suggests that everybody should read and kind of books that have influenced him in his thinking. So what are David Bowie's cultural connections with Ireland? In one of his last creative endeavours before his death in January 2016, Bowie collaborated with the noted Irish playwright Enda Walsh to create the musical Lazarus. Bowie's more general interest in Irish writing is evidence, as I've shown, in his decision to list Spike Milligan's Cocoon as one of his 100 favourite books in 2013. A phrase most associated with the satirist Flann O'Brien, Brian Nolan, Miles Nagopaline, Toshe Mahogany Gaspipe, which is essentially nonsense made up Irish, was included in Bowie's attempts at onstage banter through Irish at the Point Devereux concert venue in November 2003, as well as, kind of controversially, the phrase Chucky or Law, which you will know translates as Our Day Will Come, and would have been is most associated in the public mind with the revolutionary ambitions of the IRA. Now, interestingly, when he made these statements, England had just beaten Ireland in rugby, and he was strongly advised not to make any comments about England winning the rugby match. So he resorted instead to learning Irish and to talking to the audience and using some phrases and having fun with them. His extensive personal art collection included paintings by Irish artists such as Colin Middleton, his painting Shipyard Family, Louis Le Brocq, James Joyce's Head, and crucially, Bowie owned Jack B. Yeats' painting Sleep Sound. So, what about Bowie and Beckett? Samuel Beckett's father, Bill, or William Beckett, his last words in quite an excruciating death, he literally died roaring, died screaming. And his repeated last words were, "What a morning." And these are cited by Bowie in the song directly, Law, Earthlings and Fire, on his 1997 album, Earthling. In the same year, Bowie noted a parallel between his then current hairstyle and Samuel Beckett's on a BBC radio interview celebrating his 50th birthday. He said to the BBC interviewer, he, Bono, the well-known poet, sent me 2 wonderful bios on Samuel Beckett. On one of them, Beckett has a hairstyle not dissimilar to the one I'm sporting. And on the inside, he said, "This man's got your hairstyle, and I'm sure he's got a pair of stilettos somewhere." In 1999, Bowie revealed more about his interest in Beckett. In an online discussion with the Irish singer Ronan Keating, Bowie jokingly suggested that his musical influences were Brendan Behan and his Romans. Keating, who had listed Patrick Kavanagh and William Butler Yeats as his favourite writers, then asked Bowie to name his. Bowie tellingly responded, "Mine tend to be more Dublin-oriented. They are James Joyce, Beckett. I am a major fan of Beckett and Behan." He then refers to Yeats's Sleep Sound painting, stating, "Speaking of the hills of Sligo, one of the paintings I've got is by Jack Yeats. It shows two tramps lying down on a small hill and is reputedly one of the inspirations for Beckett's Waiting for Godot." Later in the interview, Bowie is asked by a fan, there's fan interaction going online on the thread, Bowie is asked by a fan if he'd ever attended a Beckett play in Dublin. Bowie replies in the affirmative, noting that he had seen Beckett's work at the Gay Theatre Dublin and also in London and New York. He also reveals that he saw Happy Hours in New York, but the most astonishing performance I've seen was in New York with Steve Martin and Robin Williams in Waiting for Godot. Further evidence of Bowie's interest in Beckett is provided in a Facebook post on Bowie's passing. A New York-based lighting stagehand, Fritz Frizzell, noted an encounter with Bowie before a screening of Beckett's film starring Buster Keaton. Bowie's collaborator, Brian Eno, also referred to Beckett in his instructions to David Bowie concerning the creation of David Bowie's album Outside. In preparing the band, Brian Eno gave each of the participants in the group cards setting out the roles they would play on the album, which was to be set in a dystopian future. According to the Bowie fan site, Pushing Ahead of the Dame, Eno cast in the following role: "Bowie, you are a member of an early 21st century art and language band. You make incantations, permutations of something between speech and singing. The language you use is mysterious and rich, and you use them along to several languages, since anyway most of your audience now speak a patois that effortlessly blends English, Spanish, Chinese, and Wolof. Using on-stage computers, instant sampling techniques, and long delay ecosystems, you're able to build up these dense clouds of coloured words during performance. Your audience regards you as the greatest living exponent of abstract poetry. Samuel Beckett is a big influence." Now, I've referred to Bowie's interest in Jack B. Yeats, and David Bowie was a painter in his own right. He was particularly influenced by German Expressionism, the work of Eric Heipel in particular. He was a formidable, productive painter, and he was also, as I mentioned earlier, an avid art collector. Bowie bought Jack B. Yeats' painting Sleep Sound for £45,500 English pounds from Sotheby's in 1993, with its title presumably referencing a line from William Butler Yeats' poem Lullaby, "Beloved, may your sleep be sound." It was painted in 1955, 2 years before Jack B. Yeats' death. Prior to the auction of Bowie's private art collection in 2016, Sotheby's said, "The defining characteristic of Jack B. Yeats' artistic career was its independent spirit, and that David Bowie should be drawn to the work of Yeats is unsurprising. He was a great admirer of his work and knew it well. In Yeats he found a pioneering and explorative artist that reflected his own creative impulses." Sleep Sound depicts, according to the Sotheby's catalogue, two figures lying on a moor beneath a heavy sky, and the composition as a whole borders on the abstract, with sky, land, and figures merging into one and stimulating the eye to dart across the surface. Bowie's interest in Jack B. Yeats was an important focal point when discussing his 1999 album Hours with the Irish journalist and musician and poet Eoin Carr. Given Bowie's practice of covering his tracks, somewhat unusually, he stated, "There's something about the life and death motifs in Jack B. Yeats' work that are maybe not dissimilar. Just to have that kind of work around me, I find influences me tremendously. When asked to propose a visual analogy between the songs on ours, which aimed, in David Bowie's words at the time, to capture a kind of universal angst felt by many people of my age, he suggested Jack B. Yeats. Bowie said, I have a painting of his, referring to Sleep Sound, of two bums lying on a hillside sleeping. The apocryphal story is that it was one of the paintings which influenced Samuel Beckett when he was writing Waiting for Godot, which I would love to believe. Now, in fact, it is an apocryphal story because Waiting for Godot, or the French original version, Antonin Godot, was written before this painting was in fact painted by Jack B. Yeats. Beckett, of course, has been widely documented in terms of his friendship and admiration for Jack B. Yeats, and may have contributed to the emergence of this myth. He bought on installments Jack B. Yeats' painting A Morning in 1936. But Bowie was correct to describe the reported connection between painting and Beckett as apocryphal. The writing, as I said, of Godot was completed by January 1949, and the play premiered 4 years later in Paris, 2 years before Yeats painted Sleep Sound. Now, there are some interesting parallels between Jack B. Yeats and David Bowie. Both Jack B. Yeats and Bowie were proponents of Expressionism. Bowie's interest in this movement is evidenced not only in his own paintings, including many of his self-portraits, but also in the colour, texture, and landscapes used in his album artwork and promotional videos. Like Bowie and Beckett, Jack B. Yeats worked across a number of artistic genres. He was a set designer, playwright, and experimental novelist. Similarly, Jack B. Yeats had more than one identity. He used the pseudonym W. Bird, presumably because of political sensitivities, when working as a cartoonist for the London-based Punch magazine. Yeats was an advocate of outsider art, and Bowie seems to have been particularly taken with the modernist and expressionist phases that characterized his final career. It's also noteworthy that both Yeats and Bowie self-reference themselves in their art. So many Jack B. Yeats paintings you see references to Jack B. Yeats. He appears, and equally Bowie, of course, does a lot of self-referential stuff and appearing as earlier characters in his work and so on. Over 7 decades, Jack B. Yeats' work was concerned with themes of migration, mental illness, alienation, loneliness, political and social change, themes not too far removed from Bowie's own concerns some decades later. In common with other European painters, circuses and clowns feature heavily in Jack B. Yeats' work, most notably the clown amongst people and Johnny Patterson singing Bridget Donahue, also referred to as the singing clown. That's the singing clown here. And in his latter expressionist phase, so Yeats is interesting because he started out as quite a traditional painter and then shifted quite radically in how he painted and what he painted. Yeats, in his latter expressionist phase, repeatedly painted clowns and circuses as a way of examining the role of the alienated artist in society, but also to explore themes such as the Holocaust and the mass migration of Jewish and other refugees in the wake of World War II. So this brings me to how David Bowie is influenced, and also then how he uses snippets, how he mines the books he's reading, the art he is consuming, and buying, or viewing, and how he uses that then in his own art. And this particular phrase was used in the David Bowie Is exhibition in the Victoria and Albert Museum. David Bowie is, and of course we could spend forever talking about the ... because David Bowie, of course, I was teaching mass communication theory or media sociology, we were talking about the idea of the open text, or the polysemy, of multiple layers of meaning, with possibilities and so on. But the phrase that David Bowie is plagiarism or revolution was the phrase that Bowie wanted to use about his life's work, and I think it does tell us a great deal. David Bowie was clearly influenced by a myriad of writers, including Jackie Yeats and Samuel Beckett. Outside of them were obvious ways in which Bowie engaged in a kind of found art practice. The trio of Bowie, Beckett, Yeats needs to, I think, to be understood in the deeper connections between all three men. All were heavily influenced by European movements such as Expressionism and Modernism. An interest in clowns and mime and concerns about human mortality bind Bowie and Beckett. Bowie, as noted earlier, was a fan of famous actor and clown Buster Keaton, for whom Beckett wrote his only cinematic offering film in 1965. Like Bowie, Samuel Beckett was no stranger in using clowns in order to stress the binary relationship between comedy and tragedy and the absurdity of human existence. The 1985 German television version of Beckett's final short and overtly political play, What, Where, features the lit faces of four characters who are reputed to be based on Russian clowns. There are remarkable similarities between this version of What, Where, and two promotional videos that Bowie made for some of his final songs, Where Are We Now and Love Is Lost. So we come to the kind of final creative work by David Bowie in the latter phase of his career. I'm particularly interested in the self-directed video for Love Is Lost. And Eoin and Martin and myself, we've published on this previously. We've published on extensive, what I suppose more traditionally sociologists would refer to the content analysis. We've done a content analysis, qualitative content analysis of the videography associated with this particular song. His video for Love Is Lost is of particular interest. Because while in the past Bowie performed as Pierrot, so we can go right back to this famous scene from 1980, Ashes to Ashes, right? Everybody I think is quite familiar with that video if you're a fan of David Bowie. So here he's in full Pierrot regalia. And interestingly, and I won't dwell on this, but David Bowie appears on television as a young man as part of a campaign to allow young men to wear long hair, one of the famous kind of things in video vaults that people find with David Bowie. But his first formal performance on television as an artist was in Pierrot in Turquoise. And he wrote music and songs for this. He doesn't play Pierrot in this. There's a secondary character, Cloud. So that his first performance in the 1960s was in the context of being Pierrot. And of course he was a trained mime artist originally, before he was initially a folk singer and then a comical singer and so on, and then the other characters begin to emerge. So it's about seeing him in this kind of longer tradition of him connecting with this much older tradition of clowning and so on. And this particular image is interesting because if you have 5 minutes to look at the video for Love Is Lost, it's actually quite a sinister video in the sense that it is, I think, quite obviously about Bowie killing off earlier persona. The Pierrot figure appears as Pierrot as we know him from 1980, but he also appears in the video as a black-hatted Pierrot. And we know from histories of theatre and seaside performances in the late 19th, early 20th century that audiences even knew, even then, in seaside towns, that if Pierrot appeared wearing a black hat, a murder was about to be committed. So it was a clue to the audience that a killing was about to take place. So the video for Love Is Lost is of particular interest. And while in the past Bowie performed as Pierrot, most notably in the video for Ashes to Ashes that I've mentioned, and the artwork used to promote the album Scary Monsters, in Love Is Lost, something of a greater significance occurs. Here, his use of Pierrot, including the merging of Bowie and Pierrot, with its rehearsal of the key elements of the Pierrot Turquoise 1967 storyline, suggests we think that the song is about killing, murder, violence, and guilt. So what's he doing? Is he killing off his earlier persona? By positioning Pierrot and a merged Bowie-Pierrot centre stage, the video allows the real David Bowie to sing the truth about his pasts. And he refers to the lunatic men. There are references to a black Pierrot, as I've said, and to the thin white Duke. And these allow for secrets in the video to be unveiled and to be purged. So the thin white Duke is quite a sinister figure in Bowie's own personal history. It's very much what Bowie brings with the cocaine adult artist. There's also quite a striking event in Bowie's 1970s career where he comes back from a European tour and lands in London at Victoria Station in an open-top car, and he makes a Nazi salute. He also talks in interviews about that a Hitler would be a good idea. A fascist leader would be a good idea, and he was very much taken up with, Man and Superman and sort of Aryan stuff at the time, so quite problematic. So some of what you think was going on in Love Is Lost, where he's sort of making amends, is, literally expurging himself of guilt about the past. So by positioning Pierrot, the merged Pierrot-Bowie centre stage, the video, as I've said, allows the real David Bowie to sing the truth about his pasts. So he uses two versions of Pierrot Clown. Pierrot we're already familiar with, from Ashes to Ashes, and a more sinister Pierrot, who is connected to the more macabre seaside Pierrots, who wears a black canonical shaped hat to signify murder. Beckett's influence on Bowie is, I contend, most apparent in the closing stages of his career. Bowie's relative silence and the way in which he managed to retain his privacy when recording the next day in Black Star was strikingly similar to how Beckett conducted his creative life. The surprise video for Where Are We Now, directed by Tony Arzner, with its strange, conjoined, two-headed figure, which originally had been created as a showcase piece for an exhibition for Bowie's 50th birthday in 1997, set amongst the detritus of an artist's studio, sees Bowie walking the dead in an attempt to put old ghosts to rest from the highly productive Berlin phase of his career. And again, when you look at the video, and as my son said, Dad, you obviously have no life if you spend your time looking at videos in such detail. When you look at the stuff that's dumped in the artist's studio, one of the things that's there is a Pierrot mask. It's on the ground, so it's very, very cleverly positioned. And of course, this is also echoing something that Samuel Beckett, there's very famous video footage of Beckett in Berlin, walking through Berlin, going through streets in Turkish neighbourhoods and so on. So it's kind of foreshadowing what Bowie would do at this stage of his career. So we see Bowie walking the dead, as the song says, in an attempt to put old ghosts to rest in the highly productive Berlin phase of his career. Apart from the feelings of joy that David Bowie was recording again, my immediate reaction to this song was to think of Samuel Beckett. Here was Bowie singing with the maturity of growing old, saying goodbye to some of his pasts, and facing up to his mortality. The two-headed male-female figure, the scattered debris, and a video screen showing footage of key points of interest from Bowie's Berlin past, all suggested to me the spectre of Beckett. Like a Yeats painting, the real David Bowie appears fleetingly